I want to talk about Jefferson and Madison and the War of 1812, and not spend too much time on this, but just kind of reinforce some stuff from the textbook and maybe expand on a few things that this web-based textbook goes over maybe a little too quickly. So with Jefferson, um, you have what he calls the Revolution of 1800, but it's not anything quite so dramatic as all of that. Um, he has a few major accomplishments, and I want to kind of cut to the chase here. One is that he allows the Alien and Sedition Acts that were passed under President John Adams by the Federalist Party to expire. And that's very important because the Alien and Sedition Acts were clearly unconstitutional. They clearly violate the First Amendment protections for free speech. In that they, very, very plainly put restrictions on free speech and were meant to quiet the opposition from the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans in the 1790s. And so when Jefferson comes to power in 1800, he could have allowed those acts to continue and use them now against the Federalists. And that would have been really a long-term disaster for the United States if simply one party came in and outlawed the speech of the other party and didn't allow for opposition voices to be heard. That would be really problematic for democracy, obviously. Um, so Jefferson allowing the Alien and Sedition Acts to expire, not bringing any further prosecutions under those acts is very important. Reducing the national debt is another achievement of Jefferson's as president. He has the National Bank, which I don't want to get into really for this course. It's one of those things we can, I think, just set aside. He has the National Bank sell off some U.S. government assets and then uses the profit from those sales to pay off the national debt. And he also slashes the military budget very substantially. Now, this does have some negative consequences in the War of 1812, probably, and reduces the effectiveness of the U.S. military, but he does cut the military budget and balance the budget overall. The Algerine War, Jefferson sends the Navy, the U.S. Navy, to defeat the Barbary pirates off the North African coast. Now he wins this battle because of the navy that was built up under John Adams and really George Washington as well. But it happens on Jefferson's watch, certainly, and he's the one who was commander-in-chief at that point. And Jefferson's determination to confront these pirates rather than pay ransom, which is what Washington and Adams had done, because the U.S. was not strong enough at that point in the 1790s to do anything other than pay the ransom that these pirates demanded. U.S. traders needed to get into the Mediterranean Sea. These North African pirates prevented them from doing so unless the U.S. paid ransom. It just was easier to pay the ransom until the U.S. Navy got built up enough to deal with them. And then, of course, there's the Louisiana Purchase, and Jefferson's purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France, from Napoleon, makes the United States into a major, territorial power at least, and we move from being just a Atlantic coast nation to a nation that takes up most of the middle part of the continent. This happens because of the Haitian revolutions, and without the Haitian revolutions and the need for France to find some money somewhere to pay for its army and navy to try to retake Haiti and reinstitute slavery in Haiti. If not for that, then Napoleon would not have wanted to sell this vast territory to the U.S. Now, Jefferson, when he was out of power, was a strict constitutionalist. He believed that the president couldn't do anything that wasn't explicitly laid out in the Constitution. as president, he's faced with a number of situations where that doesn't work, and he decides that he's going to interpret the Constitution differently, much more broadly, when he comes into power. And so the Louisiana Purchase is one of the more obvious examples of this, where there's nothing in the Constitution that says that the president can simply buy all this territory from a foreign government. But he does it anyway because he feels like it's in the U.S. interest to have this territory. And so he takes advantage of the offer and goes ahead with it without any congressional permission. So it doubles the size of the United States in one transaction, and is the largest single transaction, the largest single territorial expansion in U.S. history. The Lewis and Clark expedition then sets out to find out what's out there, to figure out what they just bought. They travel 14 miles a day, they record their journey and send dispatches back to the East Coast, and it's a very popular expedition for Americans to follow. Both a practical mission and also a scientific expedition. Jefferson was very interested in science and anthropology and geology, and so Lewis and Clark spent a lot of time on that as well. When Jefferson's re-elected in the 1804 election and begins his term in 1805, he really has changed his position on the Constitution and asks for all sorts of things that aren't in the Constitution, like a national university, for example. This was George Washington's idea originally, and he also tries to deal with the crisis that's looming with Great Britain and France. Both nations, Great Britain and France, are interfering with American ships in the Atlantic Ocean. Congress passes the Embargo Act in 1807, trying to get either Great Britain or France or both to guarantee that they won't interfere with American shipping, but it doesn't work. And instead what happens is that it cuts off American trade, that's the terms of the Embargo Act, from England and France, and England and France don't care because they don't need the trade as much as the United States does at that point. They can survive just fine without American trade. Jefferson also has to send U.S. troops to New England because American smugglers are crossing the Canadian border to avoid the embargo, to get around it. They need to sell their products, their goods, and so this becomes a very unpopular measure with Americans very quickly, and utterly ineffective, as I said, as well. So he has to repeal it, and by the time he leaves office in 1809, Jefferson is pretty unpopular. He'll gain that popularity back in retirement somewhat, but he leaves office a very unpopular president. James Madison comes into office after him. He's very much in the mold of Jefferson. He inherits this crisis with Great Britain and France, and they revise the embargo under Madison so that if either France or England decides to respect American shipping rights, then they get favorable trade status going forward. Napoleon seizes the opportunity and tries to drive a wedge between Great Britain and the United States on the issue. So he promises that France will respect American shipping rights. He doesn't really follow through on that, but it's enough to kind of split, to drive this wedge between the UK and the US. And a war eventually breaks out, which in the US we call the War of 1812. You got a lot of war hawks in the US Congress. They think that going to war against Great Britain is going to be a smart move, that maybe they can actually get Canada, seize Canada away from Great Britain, seize Florida. There's this thought that Great Britain's not going to want to fight for very long, and these territorial gains would be substantial for the U.S. British support for this pan-Indian uprising on the western frontier, led by Tecumseh, also feeds anti-British sentiment. And so Madison makes this decision to go to war largely on political grounds. That is, it's an increasingly popular idea, and so Madison kind of goes along with it. And In New England, the war is very unpopular. New England shippers, shipping merchants, the shipping industry is very much reliant on trade with Europe, and the war, of course, is threatening to cut that off. Most of the trade is with the UK. There's a convention called the Hartford Convention in Hartford, Connecticut, of course, that was called to protest the war and to try to strengthen New England's power within the national government. Um, it appeared to many Americans as a partisan effort by the Federalist Party, which is kind of on its way out, and it appeared unpatriotic to those Americans who supported the war. And the Federalists end up losing badly in elections once the war is settled in America's favor in 1814. This is kind of the end of the Federalist Party. Their opposition to the War of 1812 proves to be politically disastrous. The war itself, though, is pretty disastrous, and it's kind of amazing that it turns out as well as it does for the United States. The U.S. military is utterly unprepared. The U.S. government is utterly unprepared. There was a national bank that had been established during Washington's administration, but it expired now after 20 years, and so there's essentially no money to pay for this war. There's practically no military after years of military spending cuts by both Jefferson and his successor, James Madison. The U.S. then suffers all sorts of military losses throughout the war. There's no gain of territory. And there's a spectacular ineptness of the military leadership in particular. The Navy performs pretty well, but the Army does very poorly. American efforts to take territory in Canada fail. Not surprisingly, British troops defended the territory pretty easily. The British, of course, daringly sail up the Chesapeake Bay. They burn down the Capitol in Washington. They enter into the abandoned White House and feast on the dinner that had been laid out for the president and his wife, Dolly Madison. It's a great embarrassment to the whole country to see, the British just entering into the White House like that. But then they attack Baltimore. They go further up the Chesapeake Bay from Washington and attack Baltimore. And Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor is well defended and able to withstand the assault and eventually repel it. And the flag that flies over Fort McHenry becomes the inspiration, of course, for the Star-Spangled Banner, the poem written by Francis Scott Key to commemorate the battle there. And then in New Orleans, General Andrew Jackson is able to lead a force of regular army, local militia, free blacks, and French pirates all together in a victory over the British. Now, this happened 2 weeks after the treaty had actually been signed to end the war, which ends in a draw and doesn't result in gains for either side. But the Battle of New Orleans at least gives the U.S. one solid victory in the war and provides a source of patriotism and inspiration. So the war is pretty inconclusive and in many ways a disaster. On the other hand, it brings Americans together, kind of binds the nation, increases patriotic sentiment, leads to the national anthem. And so in some ways, it, in the long run, is very successful at unifying the United States, even though it militarily wasn't anything to write home about. There are a few really key court cases in this period, and I'll just kind of mention them. They're in the textbook too, but you should definitely pay attention to Marbury versus Madison. This is during Jefferson's first term. This is the case that establishes the precedent for judicial review. So when laws are passed by Congress and signed into law by the president, the judicial branch, the third branch of the federal government, asserts the right to review those laws if a court case is brought before them to decide whether they are constitutional or unconstitutional. That's not clearly laid out in the Constitution, so it's established by the precedent set in the case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803. Fletcher versus Peck in 1810, this is when Madison's president. The Georgia state legislature was bribed in order to give away a land grant The next legislature that's elected in Georgia comes in and takes back the land grant, but many people had already bought up the land by then. Um, the Supreme Court hears this case, and John Marshall, the Chief Justice, decides that the initial contract was corrupt, but completely valid. But more importantly, this case establishes the precedent that the federal Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, could review and, in fact, overturn a ruling by a lower state court. So the Georgia State Court had heard the case, and this was the U.S. Supreme Court deciding that it was going to hear the case and change the ruling. One other case, a later case that, actually, I'll leave that off for right now.